Be'ezras Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Avoda Zevachim Daf Ayin Ches, number 78, and we will begin here on the Mishnah on Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Beis. We're talking about mixtures throughout our discussion over here, and the last session we were discussing whether the limbs of carbonas that got mixed up with each other. And now this Mishnah, which is 4 lines on the bottom of Daf Ayin Zayin Beis, discusses what about the blood? Blood, as you know, is supposed to be sprinkled on the Mizbeach. What happens? The Mishnah begins, Dam shenis arav b'mayim. Let's say you have the blood that got mixed up with water. So the blood of the carbon got mixed up with water. Now, normally you would say that, look, if there's 60% water and 40% blood, what would you say? 60% water and 40% blood. That means the blood is disqualified from sprinkling it on the mizbeach. That's not true. Why? Because blood is a very thick color, and therefore to be mevatel the blood, you would have to change the color of that mixture. So the Mishnah says, Im yesh boy ma'aris dam. If it still appears to be looking like blood, kosher. It's kosher to sprinkle on the mizbeach. Okay, so maybe you would have to have like 85% water and 15% blood, or maybe less, to totally make the blood make the mixture appear like water, and then of course it's disqualified. But as long as it still has the appearance of blood, it's kosher. It's still permitted to sprinkle that blood on the mizbeach. Again, a blood that was, if blood gets disqualified from sprinkling on the mizbeach, then the owner of that carbon has to bring a new carbon. So this is like a leniency. Now the Mishnah says, this arav b'yayin. Let's say it got mixed up in wine. Okay, so let's imagine that you have 60% wine and 40% blood. So you're going to say, okay, 60% wine, it should be disqualified. And here, you can't really tell. The mixtures are going to look red either way, whether you have more wine or more blood. Nevertheless, royin oise ki'ilu humayim. We imagine the wine as if it's water, and therefore, had it been water, would it still have the mixture? Would it still have a tinge of blood in it? Would it still look like blood? And if it did, even though the majority is wine, but still, had it been water, it would still look like blood. It's kosher to sprinkle on the mizbeach. So that is a big chiddush. That's one more chiddush more than the previous. What if happened like this? Here is case number 3. Nisarev b'dam behemoy b'dam chaya. Now, you had the blood, and it got mixed up with blood of a non-carbon, or the blood of a wild animal, certainly not a carbon. So you have the carbon blood that got mixed up with other blood. So we would say, okay, this is always going to look like blood. So as soon as you have a majority of the non-kosher blood, the kosher blood is disqualified from being sprinkled on the mizbeach. Not true. Royin oise ki'ilu hu mayim. So the Tanakh of the Mishnah says you could even go lenient and say, imagine that the chulin blood, the blood of the wild animal, the non-carbon, was water, and as long as if it would have been water mixed with blood, you would still see a tinge of blood. You would still see it would have the appearance of blood. So then it would still be kosher to sprinkle on the mizbeach. So a bunch of leniencies over here. That even though the majority seems to be non-kosher, but still we can say that the blood is still kosher to be put on the mizbeach. Now we go to top of Ayin Ches Amid Beis, Amid Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein dam avatal dam. He says like this, even an unbelievable leniency by the last case. You have 95% non-kosher blood. Okay, non-kosher blood. And you have 5% of the kosher blood from the carbon. The blood will not nullify blood. It's min b'minoi. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, once something is of the same type, it never gets dissolved or nullified. So therefore, the kosher blood will always remain kosher. You just sprinkle all that mixture onto the mizbeach. There's 95% of non-kosher blood in that mixture, but blood, the kosher blood, does not get nullified by the non-kosher blood. But he says like this, but the Tanakama holds no. The Tanakama holds that it does get nullified if it was water and you wouldn't have, if this blood was water and it wouldn't look like blood anymore, then we would nullify that blood. Let's say over here, nisare b'dam pesulim. Here, the blood got mixed up, not with chulin blood, but pasula carbon blood. So one would think that we should see it like as if it's like water. Just like you said, if it got mixed up with chulin blood, we see it as if it's water. The mixture as if it got mixed up with water. So you say the same thing, but if it got mixed up with dam pesulim, it should be, it still should be kosher. Here, the din is yishafik lama. As soon as dam pesulim, let's say 50%, 55% of dam pesulim, of a carbon that was puzzle. Let's say the carbon is made up of an animal that had roiva venirva, or bestiality animal, whatever it is, and the kosher blood got mixed up with that non-kosher carbon blood. So yishafich la'ama, no matter what, spill it out down the drain. Bidam tamtzis, yishafich la'ama. Let's say, even when you slaughter an animal, the first, let's say, we'll call it the first quart of blood that comes out is kosher to be sprinkled on the mizbeach, because that blood is where the soul of the animal is located. That blood is called dam nefesh, and that's the blood that's supposed to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. The remainder blood that comes out of the animal is called dam hatamtzus, and therefore dam tamtzus is not kosher to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. So what happens if you have dam hanefesh, the soul blood, mixed up with the animal's dam hatamtzus, and you want to sprinkle that on the mizbeach? Now, technically, it should be kosher. Yishafech la'ama, you spill it out and down the drain. For whatever reason, we're going to learn about that reason in the Gemara, but there was a special gezerah that we said, no. Once it gets mixed up with a non-kosher carbon blood, or the dam tamtzis blood of that particular animal, you should spill the blood down the drain. Rabbi Eliezer says that even in that case, with dam tamtzis, if it got mixed up with the dam tamtzis blood, it's still kosher to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. But either case, im loy nimlach, if you didn't ask any question, the kohen didn't ask any question, v'nosan, then put it on the mizbeach, kosher, it's kosher. So what we learned in the Mishnah so far is that mixtures of blood versus water, or blood versus the blood of the animal versus other with other liquids, generally speaking, as long as the mixture, had it been water, would look like blood, it's kosher to be put on the mizbeach. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, Amar Rab Yochanan. Now, loy shano al Mishnah, and this is important. El shenaflu mayim l'soich adam. You have a cup of blood, and the water fell into the blood. Then you say the blood is still kosher. The blood of the carbon is still kosher, because even if a lot of the water fell into the blood, as long as the mixture still looks like blood, it's kosher to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. Aval, but, says the Gemara, nafal dam l'soich mayim, if it's the opposite case, if the blood of the carbon fell into water, okay, so then it's not kosher anymore. Why? Because rishon batal, as soon as one drop of blood falls into the water, so that water nullifies that kosher blood. And then the next drop that falls into the water is also nullified. So basically, even though you're going to have 40% blood and water mixed up, but the bottom line is that it's still not going to be kosher, because as soon as you put in the drop of blood first into the water, the blood was nullified. Each drop of blood was nullified. so it never reignites itself to become blood anymore. Even though now you're going to technically look at this mixture, it looks like blood, still it's not kosher. It only works in the opposite situation, where you have the cup of blood and water is falling into the blood. But if the blood is falling into the water, then it's not kosher. Says the Gemara, Omar Rapapa, Rapapa said, Uli inyan kisui einikain. Here, there is a concept when you shecht, let's say, a wild animal, kosher wild animal, a deer, or you shecht a chicken. There's a mitzvah in the Torah that you have to, the blood that comes out of the chicken or the deer, you have to cover it with dirt, right? So now, what happens? You have the blood of the chicken, let's assume, and that blood of the chicken fell into water. It was dropping into water. So then, and then now that the mixture looks like blood. So there we will say you're going to have a chiyuv to cover that mixture. That blood is mitzvah blood to be covered with. Why? Because you just told me regarding kachim that if the blood falls into the water, then every drop of blood gets nullified. But when it comes to a mitzvah blood, this is carbon blood, but a mitzvah blood, that a mitzvah is supposed to be performed with the blood, even though every drop of blood that fell into the water is nullified, is not called blood, but then as the mixture adds up a lot of blood, it reignites itself and becomes mitzvah blood. And there's a concept, things that are supposed to be used for the mitzvah, there's no such a thing that it gets pushed aside forever. Once it can come back, it can make a comeback. And here, this blood made a comeback. After you spilled enough blood into the water, now the mixture becomes like blood, and therefore you can perform the mitzvah of covering the blood. However, when it comes to kachim, once the blood was nullified, each drop of blood was nullified in the water, it cannot, even though you ended up spilling a lot of blood into the mixture, into the water, you would still not reignite itself to become kosher enough to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. Now the Gemara goes to a new topic. Amar Rosh Lakish said, Ha-pigel v'ha-noiser. Let's say you have two, let's cross out the tummy. Let's say you have pigel and noiser, two types of non-kosher, disqualified carbonis, right? That if you eat these meats of these carbonis, a person will get malchus. Let's say a person eats a kazayas of noisar, right? Carbon pesach that was left over, you eat it, you get malchus, or pigel carbon. If you eat a kazayas of pigel carbon, you get malchus. But what happens? Shabalulon yachal. Let's ignore this tummy. Shabalulon zebazeh. You mix them all into a mixture. So now you have a kazayas of pigel and a kazayas of noitzer that's mixed up. V'acholim, then you ate it, right? So you ate these two kazayasim, let's say, but you ate it in a mixture. So when you ate the mixture, so maybe your first spoon had, let's say you ate it in two swallows. The first spoon had 70% pigel, 30% noitzer, and the second spoon had 70% noitzer, 70% of a kazayas of noitzer, and 30% of a kazayas of pigel. So the Rosh Lakish said, you're potter, you're exempt, you're not exempt of malchus, even though technically you ate a kazayas of noiser, and technically you ate a kazayas of pigel. Why? Because the first spoon, let's say the first spoon, if you had 70% of noiser, and 70%, the first spoon, if you had 70% of noiser and 30% of pigel, the pigel, since it's the minority, gets nullified in the noiser. And therefore, you never had a kazayas of pigel. And then when you took the next spoon, and you had 70% of pigel and 30% of noisar, so you didn't have a kazayas of noisar because the noisar got nullified. So therefore, you're always going to be potter. It's impossible not to have that in each spoon that you're going to eat of this mixture there's one type going to be the majority over the other type, and it's going to nullify it. So with a roiv, that's the bottom line. If you have a spoonful of pigel, that's the majority, and a minority of noisar, the pigel will nullify the noisar. So shmamina plus, you can see three concepts from Resh Lakish. Three ideas. Shma mina isurim bevatlin zeh. You see that isur can nullify each other. We're always of the concept of, let's say, you have non-kosher chicken soup falling into a kosher chicken soup. So you can say the majority of the kosher will nullify the isur. But here you have two isurim, one's pigel and noisar. And yet you'll say that either the pigel is going to nullify the noisar, or if the noisar is the majority, the noisar is going to nullify the pigel. So isurim can nullify each other. Ushmamina, we see from here that noisin tam baroiv lav doiraisa. That here, just by a simple majority alone, it becomes nullified. And the fact that that we say that sometimes majority doesn't work. As long as it can infuse taste into the mixture, then it would remain asar. So that concept is not a deraisa concept, because therefore you don't get malchus over here. Because even if you're going to have 70% pigel and 30% noiser, you're telling me it's nullified. But why don't you say midaraisa, the 30% noiser is giving taste into the mixture, even though its majority is 70%? The answer is that concept of giving taste, and therefore it's not nullified. That concept is not a daraisa concept. And therefore you don't get malchus. Ushmamin over here, asra sofik lo yishma asra. Because in all situations, even if you end up eating pigel, a lot of pigel, a kazayas of pigel, or a kazayas of noiser, but when you're eating it, the person giving you the warning doesn't know exactly what you're going to be over on, and therefore you're not getting malchus on that, because he has a doubt how to warn you. He's going to warn you, don't eat pigel or don't eat noiser. So since he's not sure what you're doing, so therefore you don't get malchus. But we're going to focus over here. Again, from the statement of Rish Lakish, it seems to say that really we always say roiv. We always say that something is the majority becomes batal. That's the truth. Min Torah, there's no such a thing of a concept that if it's roiv and it's not nullified. Roiv, majority, once something is a majority, it's always nullified. So if that's true, Masav Rava asked a question. Then he's going to ask the question from our Mishnah. Let's say you made a dough from wheat and from rice. Now rice is potter from challah, let's say. And if the dough is a mixture of wheat and rice. So all you got to tell me in the Mishnah that if the majority is rice, you potter from giving off challah. But here the Brisa says, im yesh bo tam dagan, if you could still taste the taste of wheat, even though the majority is rice, chayeves b'challah, it's chayev and challah. So we say, how could you say something is chayev and challah if midaraisa, you always say that once you have a majority of something, the other part is nullified. So if you have a 55% majority of rice over the wheat, we should say that you're exempt from challah. And here the Mishnah says you're obligated in challah. And says the Gemara, even if the most majority is rice. And says the Gemara midrabanan, that challah that the Mishnah says is only challah midrabanan. Really midaraisa, you're exempt from challah. Okay, so you're going to tell me midaraisa, if the majority is rice and the minority is wheat, then really the wheat is nullified in the rice. So if that's true, look at the end of the brisa, the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Adam yotzi yedei chavasei b'Pesach. You can use this mixture and make a matzah out of it. Even though the majority is going to be rice, the minority is going to be wheat, and only wheat is kosher to be used for matzah. Nevertheless, it's still kosher for your matzah on Pesach. But how could you be yotzi the din matzah on Pesach if midai this mixture should be nullified? So the Gemara continues and says like this. Ella, we go to have this a little different than Ella, we go to Amud Beis. The truth is like this. Min b'she'eni mina, if two mixtures are not from the same type, right? One is milk and meat, okay? So then you can say midaraisa betama. Then midaraisa, that means as long as you can feel the taste of one part, then it's not batal. You don't go after Rive. You don't nullify it only if there's a majority. If there's, you can still feel the taste of the opposite, it doesn't become nullified. But min b'minoi, but let's say if they're two of the same type, berubai, you always say that you go after the majority. When you have two pieces of meat, pigel and noiser, they're the same. They're the same type. They're both pieces of meat. Therefore, that's why you go after roiv. There you go after the majority in order to be nullified. And um, that's why it was by the pigel and noiser. Rabbi Resh Lakish says it's nullified. But by the wheat and rice, they're two different species. And there, in order to nullify, it has to be as long as you don't feel the taste. If you could still feel the taste of wheat, even though wheat is in the minority, you could be yaitse by making a matzah out of that. Says the Gemara, why did Rish Lakish say when the pigel and nice are mixed up, you always say that it's nullified? Why don't we say, like our Mishnah says, Nishar min b'mina can mean b'she'enim? Let's imagine that if the two the same, if they're the same species, we should imagine as if they're not the same type, and you should need more than a majority. You should need the in order to get nullified, it should be the tam. The tanan, where do you see that? This b'yayin, if our mixture blood got mixed up in wine, right, and here that's like min b'minoi, because there our Mishnah is talking about does it have the look of red? So really, if it got mixed up in wine, you should say the majority. If the majority is wine, the Mishnah should say it's possible to sprinkle on the mizbeach. But that's not what our Mishnah says. Our Mishnah says roy noise kihilu umayim. We imagine as if it's a different type. It's not the type, not the look of blood. It's as if it's mayim. And therefore, it's even if the majority is wine, it still could be kosher blood to sprinkle on the mizbeach. My love, don't does the Mishnah mean roy noise liyayin kihilu umayim? We imagine the wine as if it's water. So and so why don't we say in all cases by the meat, and if they're two of the same species, right? Rav Lakish says you look at the majority. Not so. We should imagine that we should look at it as the mixture as a min b'she'ein aminoi, and that in a majority it doesn't get nullified. You need more than a majority to nullify it, because that's what we're doing in our Mishnah. Because when blood and wine are essentially the same type, because they look red, but both blood and wine are both red. And yet, the Mishnah says that even if the majority is red wine, still the blood is not nullified unless there's such an abundance of red wine. Had it been water, that mixture would not look like red anymore. Only then it's not kosher to be sprinkled on mizbeach. So we always use our imagination to imagine as if it's made of not the same species. So why doesn't Rish Lakish say the same idea? And to the Gemara, we misread our Mishnah. We imagine the blood as if it's water, and it's not kosher. In other words, what the Mishnah meant to say is that as soon as there's a majority of wine, then the blood is nullified. And we imagine this mixture is like a water mixture which doesn't go on the mizbeach. Is that true? The Mishnah should say that it's nullified. You shouldn't use this expression, roy and oise. We see that mixture of wine as if it's blood, as if it's water. Void, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yehuda, so that's not the pshat in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda oima, roin ise ki iluhu yain adam. Im dihu mar'eu kasha, v'im lav pasal. By another mixture, when you're trying to toivel a vessel in the mikveh, and it's full of red wine, so maybe the red wine is a chatzitza for the mikveh water. So we imagine that if the red wine, when you filled up the vessel, sticking it into the mikveh, that red wine would have changed colors, and the whole inside the vessel now would look like clear water. So then kosher, then you did a good tefillah. v'mlav pasal. So we see over there that you do say this concept of ro'in. You always have to imagine that it's not the same. So we see that you have to go strict, ro'in. So the question is, who does Rish Lakish go like? If Rish Lakish went like Rabbi Yehuda, then you would have to say that the pigel and the nicer meats would need more than just the majority. It would need a royin, like as long as you don't feel a tam. And says the Gemara Tanoihi, it's a machlekes Tanoim, and this will stop. Tanya, we learned in the Mishnah, Brisa, the leash yesh boy yain lovan acholav, a cup that has white wine or milk. So white wine and milk generally looks like water. Vid biloi, and you put it into the mikvah. Holchin acha harov. You always go after the majority. That's essentially the opinion who Rish Lakish follows like. But our Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Roy noise kilu yain edan. We look at the white wine, not that it's the same color as water, but it's like red wine, totally a different, it's like a min b'she'ein aminai. And therefore, in dihu mareu kosher. If it made the color dull, then it's kosher. Vimlav pasal, then if it's not pasal. So this concept of royin is Rabbi Yehuda, that even if something is min b'minai, we always view it as a min b'she'ein minai, and that is the author of a Mishnah. And Rish Lakish went with the opinion of the Tanakama. Okay, we're going to stop over here.
Thank you.
Shikaya, thank you.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Have a good evening.
Good evening.